Good morning, everybody. As we mentioned yesterday in service, we're going to start posting short devotionals, if you will, or really just comments on the day's reading. As we're reading through the bread chart, which I don't know if the camera's gonna, reading through the bread chart, and we just wanted to comment on the day's passage. I do have to confess that I have not been following the bread chart. I always start with the bread chart every year, but I think just the way my pacing through Scripture ends up being different than the bread chart, so I always end up getting off. So, having said that, that means that we're jumping into, it's just an interesting point to start this kind of conversation, because we're jumping into the end of the last letter to the Corinthians. So we're missing all the context of the earlier part of Corinthians. So my temptation is to go back and give you all the context, but I won't do that. A couple things to keep in mind as you're reading today's passage. Hopefully this gives you a little more context to what's going on. Really, the thought here starts in chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians. 11 is a continuation of that, and 12 is a continuation, and he ends in 13 and wraps up the letter. And in 10, 11, and 12, Paul's defending his ministry, and he is defending himself as the apostle, as the pastor of the church, against people who would be arguing for someone else, or arguing that Paul's not the right person, or they should be following somebody else or following a different minister. And you see at the beginning of 11 and in verses 19 and 20 of chapter 12, the reason Paul's feels like he needs to defend himself. He wants to make sure the church doesn't leave the truth. He cares about the people, and he wants to make sure they don't follow someone just because they're a better speaker or because they seem like a better leader. He wants to make sure the church is grounded in truth, and he's trying to justify his authority so that he can continue to speak to them about things they need. Like if you've been reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul is addressing some very challenging issues, because Corinth at that time in history is one of the more wealthy cities in the region. It's become a hub for trade, and so you've got a culturally diverse population. You've got native Greeks, you've got Romans, you've got Jews, you've got others from nations nearby who are all coming through the city and settling in the city because it's this kind of central marketplace and trading area for the region. And so the church is going to reflect the city. You've got a diverse church that's got people across the income spectrum, and you're dealing with the challenges and problems that come from having a diverse church. And so Paul is trying to motivate them to listen to him as their spiritual father, as the one who can address them and speak to things they need to fix. And so he's defending his ministry. Two things I'll point out quickly for you to keep in mind as you read through this passage. Paul mentions it, but I'll give you a little bit more context. One of the reasons why Paul is having to defend his ministry is because in Greek culture at the time, and especially Corinth, there was high esteem for rhetoric and for polished speech. And so in many ways, similar as it is today, the Corinthian audience was used to very sophisticated speeches. They were used to very sophisticated speech writers and delivery of speech. In fact, there were people, their whole living was just going around making speeches. So here you get Paul, who by his own admissions is not a great orator, and he's coming and he started this church, and so you've got people who are criticizing him based on the fact that he's not as good of an orator as these other people. You get a bit of the sense that for some people, the way things are presented mattered more than what was actually presented. So that's one criticism that Paul has here. The other one is that Paul didn't take a salary from the Corinthian church. He didn't draw any money from them, which he did make a living from some of his other churches. In fact, one of the reasons he can afford to not be a burden on the Corinthian church is because the Philippian church was supporting him. But the other reason was that he was bivocational. He worked, and specifically he was a leather worker, a tent maker, Acts 18 says. So that leads to another challenge. So on the one hand, you've got people who are looking at this guy who's not as polished as your typical Greek orator, who's delivering some hard truths that they don't necessarily want to hear, and it'd be easy to find reasons to dismiss him. And on top of that, he's a manual laborer. And again, the culture of the day, if you worked all day with your hands, you're barely better than a slave. So for Paul to come in and be the authority over the church of what had to be, like I said, a diverse group of people. You've got people that are used to running their businesses, used to being, they've got wealth, they've got power, and now they've got their pastor is this blue-collar, manual labor kind of guy, and there's a stigma in that culture against that. And even worse, he's not even going to let them help him, right? I almost get the sense of like, come on, Paul, at least if you're not, okay, fine, but at least let us pay for you so that you can have some dignity. At least look like the pastor should look, right? And you get that strain between the values that matter for the kingdom that Paul is trying to instill in the church, and then they're still coming from this value system that their culture has, that the city has. And you see that difficulty here. The final thing I want to point out, when you're reading chapters 11 and 12, 11 starts with this, bear with me as I'm a little bit foolish. If I was to rewrite that, if I was writing the letter, I would write, let's pretend for a little bit like I'm an idiot. Suppose I were an idiot, if I was an idiot. And so, I mean, you're reading the passage, so I won't go into all of it. You can read it, but it's such an entertaining passage when you understand that that's what he's doing. He is poking fun at all these people who have all these qualifications in two ways. He's saying, number one, the fact that you're listing your qualifications is foolish because that's not what ministry is about. But number two, if we are going to get into the qualification game, okay, I'll play along. If I was an idiot like you are, here's my qualifications. So it makes for very interesting reading. I enjoy this passage of Scripture. Anyways, I hope you guys have a great day. I'm going to take some time and short time of prayer here, start my day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks.